going to be worth a listen, because this session is titled as Inside the Making of India's Foreign Policy. And starting with the guest author for this session, the one and only Mr. Shivshankar Menon. A huge round of applause, everyone. I would request him to please take a seat on the stage. And he will be in conversation with Ambassador Amar Sinha ji and with Mr. Pradeep Baijal ji. उनके लिए भी तालियां होनी चाहिए. I would request the three gentlemen to please take their seats on the stage. And let me brief you about their lives once again. And starting with Mr. Shivshankar Menon, and it's gonna take some time because he has a huge list of medals to his badge. Mr. Shivshankar Menon is an Indian diplomat who served as National Security Advisor of India under former Prime Minister of Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs to China and Israel. He has served the Department of Atomic Energy as advisor to the Atomic Energy Commission. He was appointed Amar Sinha ji. He has been retired from foreign services. He was the ambassador in our neighborhood, Tajikistan and Afghanistan. His last posting was in Delhi as secretary in charge of economic issues, Africa and West Asia. And after retirement, he is engaged with think tanks in Delhi. Officer of the Indian Administrative Services, who retired as the chief of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. Mr. Baijal held several senior administrative positions in the Ministry of Finance and Industries at state level, but first came into prominence as the Disinvestment Secretary in 1999 and was part of the team that was involved in disinvestment of various government companies like BP, VSNL, IPCL and Maruti. And I would like to request them to please go ahead with the discussion, and हमारी तालियों का साथ इन्हें ज़रूर मिलना चाहिए.
So good afternoon. Well, it's a tough job to be seated with two giants of the field. But anyway, I think we can start this session, sir, in case you want to speak about your book. But more importantly, we had a very interesting session this morning on China. Maybe we can start as a continuation of that, and there were some unasked questions that people had. First question, as perhaps the moderator I can ask. So do you feel, and both of you could answer, that somehow we are destined to have a perpetually confrontational relationship with China? Is that in India's interest? Or we can look back to our history where we don't see traces of great confrontation between these two civilizations, but an element of cooperation. So we can start with that.
Yeah, I think there's a big divide in India today. I won't speak about the book, frankly, because the book's there and I've written in the book why I wrote the book, so I would like to tempt you to actually go and look at the book rather than listen to me. But on China, on your question, I think today in India there are really two clear streams of thinking on China. One, that confrontation with China is inevitable, that our interests clash, that we will end up. Now that, to my mind, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you act on that assumption, you will end up in a confrontation with China, because you will then prepare for it, and you get into what's called a security dilemma. It's a spiral. One side does what it thinks is defensive, the other side sees that as offensive, and therefore reacts to it. And then the first side then responds to that, so you get into this escalatory spiral where you end up in a conflict. So for me, that belief itself is self-fulfilling. It will lead you into conflict. The other, I think, opinion is that we can actually work our way into some kind of modus vivendi. Because for neither India nor China is the other the primary concern. We have other more basic things to do. For us in India, our job is to transform India. If you told me tomorrow that a confrontation with China will help us to transform India, I'd say do it. But I don't see that as being in your interest. We have enough to do. We have too many people who are poor, who are hungry, who are illiterate. We have enough to do in transforming our own country. And frankly, for China, she has other priorities as well. Her main priority, if she seeks primacy, as you said, is to overtake the US and is to achieve primacy on her own. Whether she will or not is another issue, but that's what she... And the result of that is, for the last 35 years, since 1988, we have actually kept the peace between us and each gone on developing. In 1988, we agreed between ourselves that we would keep discussing our differences, but we would resolve them peacefully. We would do it at the negotiating table. So things like the boundary, in those days, Chinese support for insurgent groups in India, etc. Where we could cooperate, we would cooperate. So we traded, and China became our biggest trading partner in goods. If you add services, it's the US today. And we cooperated on the international stage where we had common interests, whether it was in WTO, on climate change, on various other issues. But we kept the peace. The last death on our border was in 1975, October, Tulungla, and that was by accident, when two patrols bumped into each other in the fog. We signed a border peace and tranquility agreement. Basically, the situation on the border is exactly as it has been for a long time, for the last 40 years. No territory has gone this way or the other. There are bits of territory that both sides think is on their side of the line of actual control, but both have basically respected the status quo. So, is conflict inevitable? You can make it so. And either side can make it so, if they decide that it is. But it seems to me there is play between conflict. Look at what China has done in her dealings with the US for the last 30 years. She has played the space between real conflict and provoking a real conflict and improving her position steadily relative vis-a-vis the US. Look at what she did in the South China Sea. It's now a Chinese lake. She's built up her own strength. So for me, the key is what we do to build up our own strength and our own ability to deal with the various challenges that China poses us. And they're across the board. I mean, the economic ones we spoke about today morning when we were discussing Mr. Baijal's book. But there are also other challenges. Maritime security. The Chinese Navy is exercising right now with the Pakistan Navy in the northern Arabian Sea. Now, these are new developments. The Chinese send submarines since 2014. They've been sending submarines into the Indian Ocean every year, including nuclear submarines. Now, these are new developments, but the answer to that is, frankly, our own capability, our own ability, and our ability to work with other littoral states in the Indian Ocean to work together. There are solutions for each of these problems, but it will take hard work on our part. So my answer is no, it's not inevitable. Conflict is not inevitable. You mentioned history. It's interesting, we never had a border with China until they occupied Tibet in 1950. Why did we have peace? Because frankly, A, we were not neighbors. B, we might have had a huge exchange of ideas, of goods, of religion. After all, that was China's first contact with another civilization which was equal to them. And they took a lot, science, technology, goods, etc. But we did not enter into each other's political or security calculus and were not part of each other's domestic politics at all. With one very brief exception, when Nepalese kingdoms invited a Chinese army into Bihar, but that is in the 7th century, but with that very brief exception. So basically Asia was multiverses, was separate universes. East Asia, a whole system of states clustered around China, the Indian Ocean region clustered around India as the fulcrum, West Asia with several poles, Egypt, Iran, and so on. So, and they led separate lives, traded and talked to each other, and frankly, I think that's where we are going back to. If you look at Asia today, that's where we are going. There are multiple orders. Today there are already 2 internets in the world. There's a Chinese internet, where you can't use an iPhone and most of these apps. There's basically American internet on the other side. There are 3 models of internet governance. There's a US multi-stakeholder, Chinese-Russian, which is complete state sovereignty, and there's EU in the middle, saying pluralism and so on. So I think we're heading for multiple orders, for a world of multiverses, where you'll have to live with it. And some of this we live with. We live with 110 volts, 220 volts. Frankly, we don't even think when we plug in our chargers anymore. So you find fixes for this problem. And I think that's where we are going. But it's not inevitable.
Can I provoke you with a question? You see, diplomacy was a very simple affair. When India became independent and you started learning the rules of the game, it was a simple affair. There was a Eastern bloc and there was a Western bloc. And all the politics was between the United States and Russia. There was no other politics, and India hardly figured in their politics. Now, so for the diplomats, it was a very easy job. They must have had a gala time. Now, the politics has become very complex, and particularly for the states like India, because everyone is changing every day. US is changing every day. They supported China for so many decades. And now they're opposing China, and on their policy also, everyone is very doubtful whether ultimately the US will oppose the China, because the old US policy always has been do the diplomatic policy in my interest, in no other fellow's interest. So that is changing very fast. Russia is changing very fast. The Eastern Bloc has already changed, finished. So earlier there was bipolar diplomacy, now there is multi-polar diplomacy. So to say that there be no, it's a lovely situation that we have no conflict with China is no longer possible. It is no longer possible that India will no longer have a clash of interest with the United States, with England, with any state now. It is not possible. So the foreign services job is very complex, and you can't give a straight answer whether we can enter into an area of no conflict. There are far too many people who are having so many conflicts within the country and without the country. You know the answer.
Well, I think these foreign services guarantee job security, thanks to this world that he's describing. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think when we were discussing your book, I said, with China, I expect a relationship where you have some conflicts of interest, you have competition, you have contention, and you have cooperation, all at the same time. It's the same with the US. And we have a very high level of strategic congruence with the US on some issues. But frankly, the US is not going to solve our China problem or our Pakistan problem for us. There are clear differences in our approach. There might be, so this is why I say congruence. This is not identity of views. We might have some things on which we agree. And it's going to be a very complicated world where we'll have to keep building alliances depending on the issue. My mantra for that is really issue-based coalitions of the willing. So depending on the issue that you're dealing with, if you're dealing with cybersecurity, there's a certain set of countries who will share your interests. Work with them, build a coalition. If you're dealing about maritime security through the Asia Pacific, through Indian Ocean, or seas near China, wherever, then you need a separate set of countries who have capability. This is a very, as he said, a very complicated world. And it's not a simple world. Now the trouble is, of course, we all want one simple mantra, right? Non-alignment. We want one word that, and especially for politicians. But that's not the kind of world we're in. So I agree with you, actually. There will be conflicts of interest, but there will also be chances to cooperate on different issues.
Sir, thank you very much, sir. For a lot of youngsters here, so I don't know whether they have read your book, but 3 or 4 key ideas from the book, if I could tell them. That first you talked about, or you have answered this criticism that India doesn't have a strategic culture. And you have very rightly said that India actually has shown strategic boldness, but tactical reticence or caution. 3 other key lessons that I drew from your book was when you talked of the 5 different situations or decisions in which choices had to be made, that the context of the decision making of that particular moment is very important, which many of the youngsters, I'm sure, who are particularly getting educated in the University of WhatsApp, seem to forget that there is a context to every decision which was taken in 47, 49, 60. Second thing, you have made, sir, a statement that personalities matter, which is of course an obvious thing, but I would like to perhaps relate it to the current foreign policy, its orientation and how we are going. And the third is, you have talked of the importance of consensus building, whether it was on the China agreement, whether it was on the UN civil nuclear agreement. Consensus building domestically, but increasingly we see that for many domestic decisions, you also need consensus built outside. And in fact, some of them are playing out. So it's very important that how your domestic decision-making ability gets constrained by the need for consensus outside. So these three, if you sort of see the current context, and you understand what I'm trying to say, how do you think our foreign policy has changed? Because many of us see that there's perhaps more continuity than change. Styles have differed, or is it that the entire context has changed and India needs a completely new foreign policy?
You know, if you look at it, as he said in the morning, we're in a wireless world, right? So this line between internal policy, external policy is much harder to draw today. And as a result of our growth and the development of India, and clearly the rise of India, in a sense we become more dependent on the world than we were to begin with. When radical reform started in 1991, 15.3% of GDP was external merchandise trade. That's imports, exports of goods, not counting services. And most of it went west. By 2014, same merchandise trade was 49.6% of GDP. And you add services, you add remittances, $72 billion now last year. The external sector is more than half your GDP. Now, you are much bigger, much stronger, have much more influence in the world, but you're also much more dependent on the world. And this is, so the boundaries between what is internal policy, external policy, have shifted. So you can't, it's not just a question of, oh, I have an external policy, I have to build consensus at home within everyone to do it. But in a wireless world, the decision you make on who can compete in your 5G trials becomes both an internal, domestic security issue, but it's also an external national security issue. It becomes an issue, as you saw with Huawei, an issue in your relationship with China, with the US. Everybody has an interest in this now, because that line no longer exists. So, you know, much of what I said there, it's still true. I think you still need consensus, but you need consensus domestically, but you also need to do the coalition building abroad. If you have a set of interests that you're chasing, and you decide, well, I don't think you can today, in today's world, and certainly with the fourth industrial revolution coming, and you look at our situation, 80% of our imports are maintenance imports. Energy, fertilizer, these are fundamental to our economy, to our own, to just our daily well-being. So it's not as though we can draw the lines the way we did in the past. And I think it's essential that we go out and engage. Now the problem is that I think increasingly there's a temptation to use foreign policy for domestic party political purposes. And that then breaks exactly the consensus that you need to implement effective policy. And that's a problem. That makes it much harder to make foreign policy decisions, you know, which are rational. But for me, the interesting thing is that if you look at the actual conduct of Indian foreign policy, there's a tremendous continuity right through. You know, you look at, say, the land border agreement with Bangladesh, negotiated during UPA 2, initial during Dr. Manmohan Singh's visit in September 2011, but finally, and opposed at that time by the opposition in Parliament, but then finally done during Prime Minister Modi's visit. And there's a whole set of policies, civil nuclear agreement, for instance, which has been implemented, and actually implementation has been made much easier under this regime, or India one. And so for me, the continuity is impressive. And I think that's because ultimately we are all pursuing the same Indian national interest. And I think it should stay that way.
Can I provoke you a little further? You know, you've talked of personalities and you've talked of personalities and you've talked of timings. You also mentioned about personalities. Now going back to 2611, you said that the timing and the personalities, you said nothing. You said about the timing, etc., that perhaps you have not said clearly, but you said that perhaps the decision was right because the timing was not good for an intervention in Pakistan, and whatever we did was perhaps right. Now, let me make another statement, that at that time the personalities were different. At that time the governments were different. Perhaps if in 2611, I imagine Narendra Modi as the Prime Minister and not Dr. Manmohan Singh. Perhaps we would have been debating whether we should not have interfered. We would positively have interfered at that point of time. So personalities now, unlike the past, unlike no one even thought of any other policy than non-alignment. For 40 years, 50 years, it was non-alignment, and then we filtered everything through non-alignment. It is no longer the question. So your statement that 2611, the policy was right, and personalities we have not discussed. So things will change as leaders change, as international politics change, and so many other things.
But that's not what I said in the book.
No, I know that. I said that you perhaps
No, I haven't. What I said in the book actually, and Mr. Modi's government did me a big favor. I said in the book that if anything like this happens again, no Indian government will be able to react the way we did after 2611. And 1 week before the book was released in the US, Mr. Modi's government did the surgical strike after Uri. So actually it ended up predicting what they were going to do, which did my book sales wonders, so I'm most grateful to the government for that. But the point I'm trying to make about 2611 is not that this was right or wrong. In fact, this is the point the whole book makes. These are minimax choices. None of these choices gives you a solution to a problem, or is right or wrong, good or bad, black or white. Especially in foreign policy, this is a process. And what you try and do is minimize the harm and maximize the gain. And that's what you have to do. It's not a perfect world, unfortunately, and most of it is outside your control, and large parts of it you can't even predict, frankly, because you don't even know. It's not like domestic politics. It's much harder than domestic policy for that simple reason. That most of the actors you're dealing with are completely outside your control, and you have no legal framework on which to rely. It's anarchy out there, don't forget. So, what my whole point in the book is that please don't judge foreign policy like a T20 match, where every ball has to be a wicket or a six, otherwise you're not happy. That's not how it works. Foreign policy, and certainly this is why I like the continuity in Indian foreign policy. Our job in Indian foreign policy is to create an enabling environment for the transformation of India. And my simple answer to people who say, has this policy been good or bad, and who's responsible, this, that is, think of it. In the last 73 years, no other country, by all the indexes, all the metrics of power, has improved their position the way India has, except one, China. And that is in fact the source of a lot of our trouble with China, at least mentally. This sense that China has somehow made this great, as Mr. Vajpayee used to say, chalang, this great leap forward and increase the gap with us. But with every other country in the world, our relative position has improved. So for me, that is the measure of success of policy. What individuals, yes, they make a difference. But I think the calculus and the system should keep making the calculus, minimizing harm to India and maximizing gain out of whichever situation it is.
Right, sir. No, that is correct. In fact, people who follow foreign policy would know that what you're saying and what you said in your book, not only multipolarity, we have moved from 3 stages. Our foreign minister defined it only last month, actually, that from non-alignment we moved to strategic autonomy, and now we are in a phase of multi-alignment, and that is where we have to sort of evolve policies from. Sir, you did mention, and you're absolutely right, you did say that future governments will react differently, and in fact I also remember that you had advised to the Prime Minister and you were overruled. You wanted an action immediately, but that was not perhaps taken into consideration at that point. You said that Mr. Modi's government did you a favor. In fact, I feel that Mr. Modi's government did you another favor in 2016, and I will bring you back because people must be wondering why I'm not talking about Pakistan. Let me take you back 10 years ago to Sharm el-Sheikh. There was the joint statement included a reference where Prime Minister Gilani of Pakistan talks about Balochistan, and that was included in the joint statement. I think even before PM and your delegation had landed, a hell had broken out in Indian media that how did we allow Balochistan to be put there, etc., and it was a sellout, and we have acknowledged that we interfere, etc., etc., which is contradictory because every Indian actually wants that India should react to Pakistan both formally and informally. But any mention of Balochistan was actually created a furor, and you, I think in the parliament, or later you had even gone and said mea culpa, and you had said it could be, you had said that it could be a drafting error.
No, I said you could accuse us of bad drafting, but there's nothing wrong with the sense.
No, absolutely.
Because, and the proof of that is, when Gilani went home, the Pakistani media went after him, saying, how dare you put our internal matter, Balochistan, in a communique with the Indians and give the Indians a role in our domestic affairs. The same argument that Indians say when you put Kashmir in a communique with Pakistan, saying, why should you discuss your internal matters with them?
Yes.
And so, for me, actually, I think the attack was basically political. It was our domestic politics, so they needed a stick, so people used Balochistan. Now, you could argue, I think, and I still think, that it could have been drafted better maybe, but the fact that we got a leg into discussing their internal affairs, for me, was a game, and I still think it was. And then Prime Minister Modi stands up on Independence Day at the Red Fort and mentions Balochistan and all the letters that he's got from people thanking him, etc. So, this is politics, frankly.
Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but since we are running out of time, I would request you to please open it up for the audience. Anyone who wants to ask from the audience can raise their hands.
Hello, sir.
Encourage the students to ask questions.
Hello, sir.
Please stand up and ask a question.
I am Rajan from Hidwar newspaper, sir. My question is to Menonji. Currently, America and Iran are face to face. How the confrontation between both countries are going to affect the India's economy as well as its relation with both the countries?
Well, we have some very clear interests. One is in Saudi Arabia. We depend on the flow of oil through the Persian Gulf because that's one of our main sources of energy imports. As I said, we get about $72 billion worth of remittances from our people who are living and working there. So the last thing we want is trouble there. We also have major interests with Iran. Iran is our only access, thanks to Pakistan and their attitude. Iran is our only direct access to Central Asia, to Afghanistan, and that's why Chabahar is important. Iran has been a very reliable partner for us. We worked very closely together in Afghanistan against terrorism, against terrorist groups like Taliban and so on. And you know how important the US is to us as well. So the last thing we want to have to do is to choose between them. We don't want to see a conventional war. And I think we are doing what we can. You saw the External Affairs Minister spoke to his counterparts in the US. Prime Minister Modi also spoke to President Trump. So it seems to me we're doing what we can. Maybe we could think of doing more, because in the last few years the US has become self-sufficient in energy. She's now a net exporter of crude oil and gas actually. So the US interest in guaranteeing the maritime security of the sea lanes through the Persian Gulf is today much less than it used to be. And the ones who have a real interest in making sure that that energy keeps flowing, that oil prices don't go through the roof, are really us, Japan, China, Korea. We are the four big importers of energy through this strait. So it seems to me the logical next step is for us to say that we will work together and offer to guarantee maritime security of those energy flows. Not get involved in bodyguarding or in other functions as the Pakistanis used to, but to at least see that the oil keeps flowing, that oil prices don't go through the roof, do what we can. Because we are the beneficiaries of that. So there are other things I think that we can probably do, but I'm sure the government will be doing what it can.
Second question. Please be precise.
My name is Sarthak. First question, you talked about continuities. So one thing that seems to be new to me since Modi administration came to power is the rise of overt cross-border operations. Do you think that is something that is a continuity or a departure, and what if it is a departure?
By others or by India?
By India.
I don't think it's increased. It's just that we now go public.
Right, so it's just overtly.
Okay. Someone from here, from the farthest end.
United Nations Security Council, and if it does, then what would have its impact on foreign policy?
Block the POK road and you will get anything in the Security Council.
My feeling, it's useless. Why do you want a Security Council seat? Does it add anything? Does it feed anybody? Does it improve your well-being? Add anything to your GDP? Nothing. It's a beauty contest. That's what it amounts to. You need 5 permanent members and 128 members of the UN to vote for you. And for what? It's not going to contribute to your security. For me, there are other more serious things we should be doing. This is the problem when you confuse status or other people's opinions of you with real outcomes. And for me, foreign policy is about creating outcomes which work for you. That's what we should be doing, not chasing this kind of thing.
The last question.
Is the role of India in the foreign trade of the world after the independence? Prior to the war with the Pakistan in the past few years, like four wars we fought with Pakistan, and how much it has affected India and Pakistan both in the trade relationships.
Well, I wouldn't link India and Pakistan because they're frankly, Pakistan, as I keep saying, to make trouble for you for a long time. Done everything, cross-border terrorism, you name it. And yet these are the years when you've done best. But look at India in the world's foreign trade, our share has grown up. His book has all the figures actually, about how our share has gone up from minuscule, from actually at one stage just around 1%. But now, I think the problem here is that you are today at a stage where your share might be growing. You might be a major contributor to world growth because other sources of growth have dried up. But it's more important to you today than it is to the rest of the world. Yet, you haven't quite made the transition where it's as important to the rest of the world as it is to you. So you're in this difficult stage, actually, where for the next few years, unless you can keep growing your engagement with the rest of the world. Now, you know the present economic situation. For the last 3.5 years, we have been raising our tariffs. In the last 3 budgets, actually, we've raised. So our effective tariff rate has gone up from around 14% to about 17%. We opted out of our CEP. These are not good signs. because it suggests, and many people say, no, but we're not ready to face Chinese competition, to face the world. Let's close the walls, build ourselves up, and then go out. We know the pain that causes. The only time we ever went out was when there was a real crisis in 1991 with the foreign exchange crisis. And nobody has managed to do this, that I'll block the walls and then go out and be efficient. And that, not even the Chinese have managed that. It's not the Chinese state-owned enterprises who are so efficient that they can compete in the world. It's the Chinese private sector which has always been open, relatively, to competition both from the state internally and from the external sector. So, frankly, for me, there's no choice but to engage more with the world in our present situation if we want to keep growing. That's also the lesson of history. Which parts of India were the most advanced, accounted for this 50% of world GDP, when all the way up till the 18th century, and 19th century? Gujarat, the Malabar coast, Coromandel coast, and Vanga in the larger sense, which was really eastern India. These were the parts which contributed, which at one stage with China accounted for 75% of world industrial production until the 18th century. So, and those are the parts which were most open, most connected to the rest of the world. So the whole lesson of our history, our geography is that the more open we are, the more connected we are, the more engaged we are with the rest of the world, the better we do. And for me, that's a no-brainer. And that is, I think, something, but you know, there will always be sectoral interests, people who say, no, we can't face the world now, we're underdeveloped, we have to, we have to cut ourselves off. We tried that. We tried that through the late 50s, 60s, 70s. How did we do? Compare that with the last 30 years. And I think the logic is obvious.
Thank you, youngsters. I just want to add one word to what you said, sir. But the real determinant of national power today are critically three things: technology and innovation, connectivity and trade. Just draw a matrix, see where India stands, and you will know what we were discussing before, what is the real awqat of a country. Because that is how you engage with the world, and you can of course both challenge as well as cooperate, but then you have to really understand where you stand to really be honest. So these three.
Okay, before moving on, I would just like to confirm whether the guests for our next session are here. If they are not here, we can continue with the question and answers. The next guests for the next sessions are Mr. Aradhya Singh Gupta and Dr. Vijay Kumar. Do we have both of them here? Dr. Vijay Kumar is there. Aradhya sir is here, and Dr. Vijay Kumar is yet to come, I believe. So we can take one more question for now.
हेलो नमस्कार सर, मेरा नाम हर्षित तिवारी है। राष्ट्रवाद के नाम पे लड़ा जा रहा है सारी चीजें। तो आपने अपनी बुक के लास्ट में एक लाइन लिखी है कि द डिसीजन नॉट टू यूज ओवर मिलिट्री फोर्स अगेंस्ट पाकिस्तान आफ्टर 26/11। सर इस पे कुछ प्रकाश डाल सकते हैं कि ऐसा क्या था कि 26/11 के बाद जो है कोई बहुत बड़ा एक्शन नहीं लिया गया, और ये गवर्नमेंट जो है अपनी हर चीज को एक्सप्लेन कर देती है। और लास्ट टाइम एयर स्ट्राइक के बाद इन्होंने इनडायरेक्टली ये भी क्लियर कर दिया कि हमको राफेल की जरूरत क्यों है।
प्लीज कीप इट शॉर्ट।
तो मैं
व्हाट इज योर क्वेश्चन
कि 26/11 के बाद कोई एक्शन ना लेने का।
Please read the book. There's a whole chapter on it. So I can't sit here and repeat the whole chapter. And dealing with cross-border terrorism. Military force is only one part of the answer, and it's not even the answer. The Israelis have a very good phrase for this. They say it's mowing the grass. You have to go in, hit them, whatever. But you have to go back and mow the grass again. The grass will keep growing. Military force is not the answer. It doesn't stop cross-border terrorism, especially when it's sponsored by a state, as it is in our case. There is no way that military force can solve the problem. So you need a whole combination of things. And in the process, you have to keep mowing the grass. It's not that we have not done, actions against, whether it's whatever you call them, surgical strike or cross-border or whatever. We have done that consistently since the 50s. In fact, I like to say that there isn't a border that we haven't crossed in the time of the Republic. But we never used to announce it, because we used to do it for primarily across the line, for instance, to restore the balance or dominance in a particular sector, to restore the peace in that sector, or to convey a very clear political signal about something that was going on. But if you do it in order to convince your people that you're a hero, or to win an election, then you have to announce it. The problem with announcing it is, then he also has to show that he's done something. So either he has to say, no, kuch nahi kiya, nothing happened, it didn't happen. Somebody's lying, obviously. Or else he has to be seen to do something. As you saw in Barakot, he has to show that he's done something, that he's managed to get one of your mids or something. So he's also a hero, you're also a hero, you both work with. But that's plain domestic politics. Has it solved your problem? No. And actually, the domestic politics has made it harder to solve your problem, or to come to any understanding. Because as you said, we're in an age of ultranationalism. Now, the one thing that ultranationalism does is, it reduces your ability to give and take, to bargain, to make the compromises that are part of negotiating, are part of diplomacy. So, actually, we're in a much harder situation today. And I don't mean only India, ultranationalism across the board, whether it's Xi Jinping, whether it's Abe, whether it's Trump, so Erdogan, Putin, I can go on and on, this list is very long. But we happen to be in that kind of age. So therefore diplomats will have work, but they will have harder and harder work, even though the IS doesn't think we work.
Cool. Finally, the last question for the session. So please stand up.
I certainly hope it doesn't remain in its present condition, because this is the worst of all worlds, for everyone, for us, for the Pakistani people, for the world.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. This marks the end of this wonderful and iconic session.